Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Stephanie Bowen. Stephanie is editor of the award-winning Wilson Quarterly, the Wilson Center's digital magazine. And as is our tradition, when a new issue hits the virtual stands, we have Stephanie drop by and talk to us about it. And she's joined by one of her collaborators on the issue, Lauren Herzer Risi, director of the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, John. Thank you.
So, Stephanie, the summer 2024 WQ, the Great Population Shakeup. Tell us what the issue is about.
Sure. It's about our shifting demographic trends and what we're seeing across the world and how those demographic trends are really something that we should be paying attention to. We thought for a long time about doing this. When the population hit 8 billion a bit ago, we started talking about it even before then. And finally, we're able to bring something together that I think really is a nice collection of regional and subject matter pieces that paint a picture of how demographics really do impact foreign policy decisions.
And Lauren, normally Stephanie and I will have one of the authors on and we'll talk specifically about his or her piece. But she told me you played a larger role than the typical author for this issue, that you were almost a co-editor along with her, and you wrote the overview. So give us another preview, an additional preview of the types of things that are covered in this issue.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think one of the things is, the Environmental Change and Security Program, population has long been a focus of the program, looking at population, environment, and security together. And one thing that we have found is that even though population demography is foundational to policy, it's not really well understood by policymakers. There's a lot of misperceptions around what constitutes population trends. And getting those, sort of correcting those misperceptions is really going to be key to developing policies that provide security and health to populations moving forward. And so one of the things we wanted to do with this issue was really bring to policymakers and the general public a better understanding of what is meant by demographic trends, why it matters for our health, for our security, for the environment, for economics, for trade, right? How all of these pieces of demography fit into our daily lives and what that means for how we think about policies.
Stephanie, I'm a big fan of your work and of the WQ, and I often rave about the value of an issue of the WQ. I'm a news junkie and an avid reader, and pound for pound, there's not a better investment of time than an issue of the Wilson Quarterly. And I think this issue in particular is so many dots are connected, so many challenging things to think about for anyone interested in life on planet Earth. So I'm not going to worry about trying to be too linear and in this discussion. And I think the three of us can just sort of make connections and bring things up as we think of them. But I thought it might be fun to start with the article that you co-wrote. Could you tell us about what you focused on specifically as an author and not just an editor?
Yeah. First of all, I co-authored a piece with Tyler Marshall, who's a journalist who's reported from all over the world about the workforce that is needed as it relates to shifting global demographics. And we ended up writing that because we really wanted to make sure this was covered, and it wasn't one that was sourced through different means. And the more I read about it, the more excited I got to be learning about this topic, and reporting on it and making sure that there was that it was a part of the issue. And you'll see a lot of dots connected through the issue in this piece, because what's happening in China with its aging and declining population is the opposite of what's happening in Africa with its growing and youthful population, and how that impacts the workforce of the future. We took a pretty narrow lens to see, okay, what does it mean with China's population aging and shrinking? China, who's provided a lot of of the global workforce, um, then when you look at what can Africa, who has the biggest youth bulge, can they fill the gap? So that was the lens that we looked at, and um, they can, but it's going to be tough,
Yeah.
is the bottom line. But there were a lot of things that went into it, and what there were many aspects of what how best to prepare the workforce of the future. I could tell you about them. There are a couple that really stood out to me as we were doing the research. I'd say, and this is something that I found has been increasingly talked about in general when you're talking about education and how to, really how education systems should be, changed. Really setting people up for lifelong learning, for being able to um, change and shift through time and not just go to school with one thing in mind for a career in X that you'll do until you retire, but really being able to um, work in a rapidly evolving situation, which is the world, technology, climate, people. I mean, it's really everything is really shifting, and to set up successful, the future of the workforce to make it most successful. It has to account for that and many other things.
Yeah, the statistics on just how many times a person will change careers are stunning, how quickly that's changed. Anecdotally, I remember meeting a insurance executive in Boston who started in the mailroom and then rose to executive vice president level. And he was telling me his son had been in the workforce for 5 years and had changed jobs 3 times. And so this is the contrast of that. You were I think, Lauren, you were about to say something about this question of workforce. No, I thought I heard it. Let me ask you a question, then, Lauren. When, what Stephanie describes in the workforce becomes a microcosm of this bigger discussion where we're talking about countries that are aging rapidly or those who are experiencing a youth quake. And then I'm guessing there are some that are hitting close to that fertility rate replacement level. Can you give us sort of a regional geography quick snapshot, Lauren, about where are the hot spots for aging populations versus those experiencing youth bulges? And are there any countries that are getting it just about right?
Well, I mean, I think about 28% of the global population lives in countries whose population has peaked. And this includes Japan, Germany, China, and Russia. I think the only reason the US isn't on this list is because of immigration. But by 2054, there'll be an additional 38 countries whose populations have peaked. A lot of the growth is occurring in large countries like Indonesia. Stephanie mentioned Sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of the countries across the Sahel are still rapidly growing. The Middle East is growing, right? And so I think what is one of the reasons we wanted to bring this issue out now is because we are living in a different demographic moment than we've ever seen before, right? And those changes are going to continue rapidly. And so, all of the systems that we have in place today have been built to meet the needs of populations. And they've been pretty successful, right? In 1900, life expectancy was 31 years. Today, it's over 73, right? So there have been significant advances. But will those systems still be able to meet the needs of populations as we see these changes occur, and sometimes called the demographic divide in terms of which countries are growing or shrinking, and what does that mean for the global economy, for health, for prosperity. And so being able to, I think one of the things about this issue is that through the country and regional sort of focus pieces, you get the story of what this looks like in the ground or on the ground. But when you zoom out, you have to think about how all of these pieces fit together in terms of the global economy and also in the context, like Stephanie said, of a global energy transition and climate's impacts and AI, right? It's not population on its own, it's how it fits into these broader trends.
That's one of the reasons I found this issue so compelling, in that there's barely any topic you can think of that isn't touched upon by what we're talking about here. And I want to ask both of you sort of a general question. I'll apologize on how general it is, because I know generalizations are often, just roadmaps to inaccuracy. But as I'm reading the issue and listening to both of you today, I'm wondering, in your opinion, does demography or demographic changes play anything close to a large enough role in public policy discussions around the globe? It's not an issue that you hear in a campaign cycle that people are talking about, maybe indirectly when they talk about migration or things like that. But are we really ignoring this issue at our own peril? Should public policymakers in particular be more focused on these rapidly changing demographics?
Go ahead, Stephanie.
Okay.
Oh, you flip a coin for that hot potato.
Yeah.
I see
I
Stephanie.
mean, I think yes. I mean, I think they should be paying more attention, and it's not necessarily, and Lauren can probably sum this up maybe a little bit better, but it's not necessarily that they're not paying attention to demographics. They're not really, understanding the nuances of how, because one of the things that Lauren said in her piece, I loved this line. She said, demography is not destiny, but it's not divorced from it either.
Mm-hmm.
And that really goes to the options that countries have to understand what their population looks like, understand what a neighboring country's or a regional, country or a competitor's country's demographic looks like, and make decisions that are based on that deep knowledge of an understanding of demographics, I would say.
Can I just
Stephanie,
add
don't you
that-
love it when you're quoted by the editor? You're so eloquent in your writing that she's quoting you directly.
I would just add that policy can be short-sighted, right? It's driven by election cycles and what's happening in the headlines today. And demography has like sort of a long shelf life. The investments we make today in women's health, in education, in getting girls to school, in, sort of these sort of foundational investments are going to be what yields benefits decades down the line, right? And so there's a little bit of a mismatch. But I don't think that anybody that you talk to on the street would feel like demography wasn't part of their life. I think, for my generation, we're the sandwich generation, but also I've heard it referred to as the panini generation, right? The pressure of caring for older parents while also caring for young children. I think that there's a recognition in the U.S. that there is an aging population, and the need for elder care and for people to retire and let others into the workforce. These are debates, right, that come up.
Sure.
And so I think it's always sort of there in the back of people's minds. I do think that there still isn't a great understanding of what it means in practice for policy. And that's what we're trying to get at.
Yeah, I love the panini generation getting squeezed. A couple of things about this, and both area. The article you wrote, Stephanie co-wrote about the workforce. There are these other issues that are percolating in the background that will have significant implications, like AI in the case of the workforce. And Lauren, you've done so much work over the years on climate, and that looms large in these demographic discussions, because as populations grow and the need to produce more food grows, and the changing climate creates different scenarios for where crops can be grown, all of this overlaps in such a dynamic way. Let's break it down. Stephanie, first, if you talk about your thoughts on climate as it relates to demographics, and then Stephanie, we'll ask you about in the workforce some of these other issues like AI.
John, you've renamed us both Stephanie.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, Stephanie and Stephanie.
I'll take
Lauren
that as
first.
a compliment, but
Me too.
Well, everybody needs an editor. I need one in real time.
No, it's fine. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Okay, so I'll talk about workforce. And, something that you just said, Lauren, about the long view of demography, and that we really need to take that long view, I think is evident in researching the workforce development piece. Because when you look at what China did, say in the, when they were first kind of coming onto the scene, they really invested heavily in clean water and health and education. And they had a laser focus on that, which helped them become who they are on the, economic stage. And it really, that was a long view that they had, and really held forth with that. You see the same thing with the other country that we talk about, is Estonia. When they gained their independence from the Soviet Empire, they really made a point to create an education system that was truly theirs, that they invested in technology, made sure every classroom had a computer, and really also developed curriculum that was not so specifically connected to the Soviet Empire, but one that really was Estonian. They really wanted to be independent and really thought about who they are as a people and a culture. And the people that we talk to really, Estonia is doing very well in terms of preparing their workforce and creating the type of environment. I think in part because of that. And it also was, when you look, as I mentioned, our piece kind of zeroed in on Sub-Saharan Africa as, being the place to offer the most young people for the workforce that will be needed for the future. There were a lot of lessons that it could learn, that the different countries could learn, and how to take some of those lessons and help prepare their future generations.
And John, you asked me to take on like two pretty big topics with the population piece and the climate change, but I'll just
Yes.
make like
Well, just,
two quick.
talk to us about, I know it's a big question, so let me try
That's
to
right.
narrow it. I'm really thinking in terms of how growing populations or aging populations may be affected by climate change, and what are the
Sure.
implications of that?
Well, we do know that some of the countries with the most rapidly growing populations are also those on the front lines of climate change, right? And those least resourced and sort of have the least capacity to respond, right, to climate's impacts. And so that's one thing that needs to be considered. And I talk about climate change as the context in which all of these things are happening, and population is part of that. And so what does that mean for how we respond? And it's really about increasing the resilience of populations, not just to weather events, but to sort of the broader sort of livelihood security, job security, being able to go to school, those having health, right? So what are the investments we can make in education, in health, in the economic structures of those countries, so that people are able to sort of diversify their livelihoods away from, if the crops are no longer growing where they're living, what other sort of pathways do they have for resilience? So one thing is to think about sort of where is climate change going to have the biggest impacts, and a lot of it is where those people where there are the most rapidly growing populations least equipped to deal with those impacts, and recognizing that. The other piece I'll say is that it's also about the energy transition. This is a pretty significant global transition, right? And most of that you think about the energy needs of growing populations in sub-Saharan Africa, paired with the need to meet global climate goals, and the fact that there are still 600 million Africans without electricity. So it becomes a sort of a question of justice too, right? Like, how do we ensure that everybody has access to the energy that they need in a way that aligns with our global climate goals, and allows sort of for this climate resilience to grow. And so that is another piece of not just looking at specific countries and regions, but looking at how we all sort of all of these trends together and what the investments on the part of the developed world can be to help shore up the resilience of our developing country partners.
I want to ask both of you to kind of put your heads together on this next round of topics that we'll cover. And it has to do with one of the things that the issue both covers and that both of you in your remarks have done, where it's not just a doomsday scenario. It's not just the sky is falling, right? There are opportunities, there are challenges, there are negatives, there are positives. It's a mixed bag. And a lot of where it ends up is going to have a lot to do with the decisions that are taken along the way. So if you could talk to us about those things, what are the potential positives? Things like a youth dividend that could create an economic dividend, or maybe some of the downside, like political instability that could arise from a rapidly growing youth population in need of jobs and other things. And maybe if you could tie it to some of the specific things that are covered in the issue, like China, India, some examples of where this is actually playing out and what we're seeing and what the trend lines indicate. Are we making decisions where this could turn out to be a positive thing, or are we, heading toward an iceberg? So any, kind of random association, what are the things you think about in this regard? Stephanie?
Sure, I'll start. I think, every piece sort of addresses those opportunities and the challenges, because, that is just the reality. In Latin America, for example, we do a piece on Latin America. It is also aging, and one of the things that really struck me, a journalist by the name of Elder Marinho reported this piece, and he talked to a lot of people who no longer want to have kids for a variety of reasons. They said, it's too hard. I can't, it's too expensive to raise a family, or I can't balance work and family. Then there were people who had kids and exited the workforce, women who left. And so there are, because they weren't getting the accommodations that were needed to make sense for them to stay working. So there are some specific policies and opportunities, that are, that now could make a more fair and equitable society that will also benefit the country as a whole, the workforce, and the economic stability of the region. I also think about Sarah Barnes and Jay Gribble. They wrote a piece on fertility targets, and it was very interesting to me. Fertility is always, a go-to when it comes to population dynamics. China's one child policy is, of course, the most well-known one when countries are trying to control their population growth, or one way or another. Other countries will offer, subsidies and different benefits for, people who have kids. But there are other things that should be considered when, beyond how many children, it's very personal. They go into a lot of different examples from different countries and look at what's worked in the US, in China, in Japan, Sweden, and what hasn't, and give us a new frame for thinking about how to look at these issues. So those are two that immediately came to my mind.
Yeah, again, I'm sorry to keep beating this drum, but the connective tissue in this issue and how it touches on just about any type of topic that you could imagine. Sexism comes into play. I can't remember which piece, but there's something in one of the articles about if men in the workforce have a child, they're taken more seriously. If women do, they're viewed as a liability. So there are all kinds of things happening here. Lauren, back to you on this question of, are there countries that are trending in positive directions because they're managing this correctly, versus countries that you could use as examples of they need to figure something else out because it's not working?
Well, I mean, I think you could look at a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa that invested in voluntary access to family planning and girls' education and saw their fertility rates decline. Um, I mean, we know that when you send girls to school and when you provide women with health care, that countries it yields significant economic and social gains for countries, right? So there are things that we know to do. Whether they get done is another issue. I think, but I also think it's not. I think we can get caught up in the numbers, but really the question at the end, the point is like, are people living healthy, prosperous, secure lives, right? And what are the policies that are sort of foundational to providing that pathway? I
And
thought one of the
is it sustainable? Right?
yes, 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 of course. Yes. Um, one thing that stood out to me when I was reading some of the other articles was the article on India by Leela Visara. And she wrote that women's mental health had been significantly let's see, poor maternal health had led to like when they addressed women's mental health, the women lived longer, the babies were healthier, maternal mortality was cut in half, right? And so, and that it wasn't like they were addressing the women's mental health, they were just providing like sort of institutional support. They were providing access to care in a more effective way. And so the mental health gains of that were significant, which then had significant what would you call it? Bodily health? I don't know, like sort of, right? And so recognizing that all of these issues are tied together, and it's a complex picture and it's context specific, and it matters a lot how people feel about their own bodily autonomy and what the access to care looks like. But sort of starting with some of these sort of basic premises can be really useful.
Yeah, good stuff. Stephanie, I want to ask you about migration and immigration and what the issue has to say about that. Various articles touch on it. And earlier, I think, Lauren, you had talked about how one reason the U.S. isn't on a certain list, or maybe it was you, Stephanie, about is because of enough migration or immigration that we are replacing workers or feeding the workforce in ways that maybe other nations aren't. This is kind of a perilous moment in global politics where we see the German elections, the rise of far right political parties that are anti-immigration, and yet what the demographers are telling us, what the people who are writing in your issue are telling us, is that if we don't move people around, we're going to be dealing with all kinds of unsustainable situations.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up. Jack Goldstone, he was also part of what I like to call the WQ Brain Trust on this issue. He and Richard Sincata, who wrote the interactive piece that looks at a country's age structure as it relates to its overall development. I would check that one out. But Goldstone's piece on immigration was really, I mean, he made the case for migration. He really, from his demographer, sociologist, demographer lens, taking on all of the negative connotations and really showing, actually immigrants don't commit more crime. And not only are some of the myths not true, but the value of bringing immigrants into the country, the US is one, but other countries. One piece that we were not able to do that we really wanted to and just didn't have the time and capacity was to talk about caregiving and immigration. And that, when you look at the US, Lauren brought this up, being part of the Panini generation. I love that. I mean, there's such huge caregiving needs. When you look, I mean, just anecdotally, every care facility I think I've ever been into has a majority of employees are from from different countries, and they, a lot of our healthcare system is made up of, and I don't have a number, but anecdotally, I know it's a lot.
Yeah.
But I think the value of immigration is such, and I mean, Jack doesn't, in his piece, he doesn't say it's perfect. He says we do need laws that will make orderly immigration uh, better. We need to really look at that. And instead of being afraid of immigration, let's look how to make the process stronger so that we can welcome in these workers that we need. So I think that's really a good piece. Definitely worth checking out. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Lauren, I want to go back to this question of sustainability, right? So much of what we've been talking about and what is covered in the issue, there's a certain unspoken assumption in a lot of it about that the future will look a lot like the past in some ways, as far as what we consider a good lifestyle, right? And what a middle class looks like. And really, long-held assumptions in many cases need to be thrown out the window. Can you talk a bit about that as you look into the crystal ball, based on your work on sustainability? What are some of the things we have? You mentioned one already, right? Energy, that we really need to rethink energy. Are there other areas that are going to just have to look a lot different moving forward if we're going to achieve the goal of managing these demographic changes and creating good lifestyles and sustainability?
Yeah, I wish I had a crystal ball.
Yeah.
Or maybe I don't. I don't know, actually. Um,
Right, right.
uh, I mean, okay, so energy systems, yes, food systems. But a lot of the scarcity is man-made, right? Like, and when you think about climate change, for example, it's not the source of climate change is coming from the developed world, which has a fertility rate that is much below other parts of the world. And so the source of unsustainable consumption is not population numbers, right? That being said, as especially in sort of developing countries, as they develop, you want them to have access to the same benefits of development that the rest of the world has had access to. I think, when you think about food systems, energy systems, I think, we're gonna lean on technological advances, but that is not a silver bullet. It is gonna have to come down to consumption habits and patterns. When you think about like plastics, for example, the consumption of plastics and what it's doing to our oceans, to our bodies, to our land, there's a lot more awareness raising that's gonna need to be done. In terms of food systems, we saw, the Russia's incursion into Ukraine through global food systems, a big stressor, right? And so we have a very integrated food system that relies heavily on global trade. And so thinking about where our food is grown, how we're growing our food, where it goes to, what kinds of food we're growing, right? And not just crops, but also you think about like the impact of beef on land and climate change. So all of these issues are integrated in really complex ways. There's a lot of power dynamics at play that make it difficult to untie those knots, I think. But there's also a growing awareness of the challenges that we face. And I will say that the sort of rising generations are coming of age with an awareness that most of us didn't have. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yes.
it does give me hope if we are able to provide access to the tools and the education and the resources that they need. Not that I want to say like, it's on them, but I think there's a partnership there, right? And a recognition of the work that needs to be done.
Well, like in a good relay race, we don't want to drop the baton and the handoff, right? We want it to be
Right.
more seamless than that. I want to take a big virtual highlighter and highlight something you said earlier in your answer, about, and I'm only paraphrasing, but essentially you said that a lot of these problems are human made, and that if we build a better mousetrap, there are some solutions available to us. And in the last article in the issue, this statistic about enough food produced to feed 11 billion people, and I think the current world population is 8 billion. Is that correct?
Yeah, and it's going to peak
And
at
yet
like
7 million
10.
kids die from hunger or disease each year. So that speaks to exactly what you're talking about. Some of these solutions are attainable if we can figure it out and if there's enough political will to get us there. Stephanie, final thoughts on this issue, and then I'll ask you for a preview of what you're working on next as well. But I know we, as promised, we did a nonlinear discussion, but we covered a lot of ground.
We did cover a lot of ground. Other pieces that I want to highlight, we have a great piece on China from Wang Feng, and a great piece on the Middle East from Clement Gibbon, and a wonderful photo essay on Nigeria's youth population as representative of Africa's youth population from curated by Amarachi and written by Amarachi Nwosu. I think, yes, and the climate piece that you quoted, that was from Mark Maslin and Shuka Badarian. A lot of really terrific authors in this issue that I think do bring it all together. And I think anyone who reads through it is going to have a much deeper understanding of this issue, and I think will enjoy it. There's some so that is all I have to say on this issue. Coming up next, our fall issue is taking a look at the future of humanitarian assistance. And this is another one we've been talking about doing for a while, because we've seen complex emergencies getting more complex, getting more difficult, and what does it mean? How is the humanitarian assistance sector reacting to those changes? What needs to change? Who's supporting the efforts? Who's not? There's a lot to look at, and I think hopefully we'll come away, policymakers will come away with a better understanding of humanitarian assistance, what it's accomplishing, how it can be changed to be more effective, some new things on the horizon. Those in the sector, I hope, will be inspired and also see new things that will help them motivated to do their work. So.
Well, thank you, Lauren. Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie, as well. Terrific discussion. I learned a lot from this issue and from speaking to you today. And the best news is for our viewers and listeners is we're not selling anything here. The Whistling Quarterly is available to you free of charge. We're just inviting you to join us in an exploration of some important ideas and discussions. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, that you'll read the Wilson Quarterly, and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for your time and interest.